This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. Now, in the past, I've shared with you a little bit of background on my family, my wife, my kids, particularly back in the early days of the podcast. Today, I want to share with you a personal story about one of my grandchildren, Caleb. Caleb's coming up on 8 months old, lives with his parents and his two sisters in Florida, up in the Panhandle. Now, recently, Michelle, my wife, and I, we were in Asia for the month. We spent 2 weeks in Japan on vacation. I taught some workshops on the 7 Laws of Innovation in New Zealand, and then spent a little bit of time in Australia on work. While we were in Japan, we received an email and a phone call from my middle daughter, the one that lives in Florida. And she was concerned because Caleb was acting a little strange. He was having kind of these spasms. And my wife, being the nurse in the family, instructed her, hey, shoot a video, send it to me. Of what she did, my wife saw it and immediately recognized that it was a neuro issue, and instructed my daughter to get it looked at immediately. Ultimately, Caleb was diagnosed with what's called West syndrome, which is infantile spasms. Only 2,500 children are ever diagnosed with West syndrome. There's some risk to this. If the seizures are not brought under control, there is an increasing risk for brain damage and learning disabilities and impairment. Now, before we even got the diagnosis, my daughter and her husband started working the issues to get him in to be seen by a doctor. My son-in-law is a pastor at a small church in Florida, and therefore they don't have medical insurance through the church. They instead are using the Affordable Care Act insurance available in the state of Florida. Challenges started to show up right away in the fact that for him to be looked at by a specialist, the only hospital that took ACA insurance was more than 4 hours away. And when they called to get the appointment to get him evaluated, it was a 5-month wait before they could get the appointment. In the meantime, my wife and I were more than a little stressed. We were still in Asia, but having daily phone calls back to the States as all of this was unraveling. Just as we were coming back into the States, Caleb came down with a fever and suddenly was having a significant number of these infantile seizures. Literally the head movements, etc. So they took him to the hospital that evening and immediately recognized that there was something more than a local hospital or the emergency room could handle. And they arranged for him to be transported by ambulance 4 hours to the hospital that takes the Affordable Care Act insurance. And as a result of that, that is where we received the diagnosis of West syndrome. Again, it's an extremely rare condition. It's extremely can be very debilitating from the standpoint of if it's not caught early. Fortunately, we caught this very, very early. But the obvious result of is after you receive such a diagnosis is what are our options? What drugs, what treatments are available for such a rare condition? And that began a whole series of processes on our part to begin looking at how do you, quote, fix this, right? And I think that's a natural reaction. Something's broken. Think long and hard about it, break down the issues, and go about trying to, quote, fix this. At the hospital that ultimately, and it's a major university hospital in Florida, great doctors, great hospital staff. Again, this is an extremely rare condition. Only 2,500 children are diagnosed with this. And so it's not like there's a huge amount of options in the whole process here. And needless to say, with the fact that they already have two other children, my 5-year-old granddaughter, 3-year-old granddaughter, and then Caleb at 8 months, they've got 3 kids and trying to keep everything normal and going forward while trying to figure out what to do with regards to the diagnosis of West syndrome for Caleb. A little bit more on West syndrome. West syndrome is they call it infantile spasms. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, but it's kind of along the lines of infantile epilepsy. And through this whole process of now, having a name to the diagnosis and immediately going out to Google and going out to the major medical site and starting to search, there's not a lot of information because it is such a rare condition. What this ultimately, though, then is it dropped us into the world of orphan drugs. Now, orphan drugs are those, drugs or therapies that typically don't get developed because there's too few people who have that condition to make it economically worthwhile. And orphan drugs are what I would call the pharmaceutical industry's version of orphaned innovations. Innovations that are done, but the marketplace is just way too small to make it reasonable for someone to design, produce, manufacture, ship, sell, and support. The market sizing is just way, way too small. And dropping into this world of something that I just knew nothing about with regards to orphan drugs has been an incredible eye-opener as to what is the challenges when you are looking at innovations, technologies, biomedical, whatever, to impact people's lives, but the condition that's impacting a person's life is so small from the standpoint of the people that can be saved. What are your options? What do you do? How does this all work? And let me tell you, this was more than eye-opening for us. I'd heard a little bit about orphan drugs, had never really never dug into it because I don't come from a pharmaceutical background. I don't do innovation work in medical. I did a little bit of work when I was on the innovation board at Roche, working with them on innovating solutions for type 2 diabetes. That was very eye-opening for me, and I enjoyed the 3 or 4 years that I worked with Roche as an innovation advisor on their type 2 diabetes work. But it's not a background I have. My wife, on the other hand, is a nurse. She is spent 25 years of her nursing degree and career as a neonatal intensive care nurse, working with extremely sick preemies in the NICUs at leading hospitals such as Northwestern and University of Chicago and others. But it's also a little different when you can read about it and it's an interesting article in USA Today versus all of a sudden it's impacting your family. And what does that really mean? So, needless to say, we spent a lot of time digging in on what the orphan drugs issue is, the challenges, how it really impacts people's lives. And I've taken a step back and looked at it from a much broader context of what I'm calling orphaned innovations. And when I look back on my career, I've had these challenges around what I call orphaned innovations, just never had a label for it. I've never been able to name it something in order to understand what it is, the impact, and what options there are to address these issues where there's just an incredibly small market for these drugs or technologies or innovations or whatever they might be. So today's show, we're going to talk more about these two areas. One is orphaned innovations. What are they? What are some examples of those? We're going to talk some more about orphan drugs. What does that mean? What I've learned through this whole process. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, so what do we do about this? It isn't just kind of an interesting, here's some facts from a show, but what is it as a society we should be doing when looking at people's impacts and what the role of innovation could play in having a significant positive impact in quality of life. So this is a little bit of a different show than we've done in the past. We're going to get into some personal stories, some personal experiences, some of my family's frustrations, but I hope it is enlightening. So stay right there. We'll be right back.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Before we jump back into the show, I just want to extend a big thank you to one of our sponsors, and that is Zoom. Zoom has been sponsoring the show for over a year now. Through their financial support, we're able to support the nonprofit charity work that we do, both with Hacking Autism and Pioneer Education Africa. And so I just want to extend my thank you to Zoom and Eric Ewing, who's the co-founder and CEO at Zoom. They've been big supporters of our work here and enabling us to keep this content that we produce for you free of charge and available via the podcast. So with that, check them out. By far the best video audio collaboration technology that's out there. I use it every day, and I've used it for almost 2 years now, ever since we've started the show. That's how we bring the guest in, but it's also how I use it in my day job in collaborating. Zoom has made available a free account, so check that out, killerinnovations.com/Zoom. The free account allows you to collaborate with up to 50, that's right, 50 people in a video collaboration approach. So check it out, stress it, experience it. Trust me, it's the best thing out there. So once Caleb is diagnosed with West syndrome, I wasn't aware of the issues around orphan drugs, but I was aware of the challenges for orphan innovations. Now, this is a new name. I didn't have a name for it when I was experiencing it in my previous career. So let me back up a little bit. When I was CTO at Hewlett-Packard, one of my responsibilities, one of the teams that reported to me was the accessibility team. So this was the team that developed technologies that enabled people with special needs, special conditions to be able to access computing technologies, access the internet, be able to interact with software, etc. Now, these are all great and exciting technologies. We had our own research team that just focused on accessibility. And the team was very motivated because these innovations could have a significant impact on people's lives. And we actually had people on this team that had been doing this for many, many years. And it was less of still a job, but it was really a mission. It was really a purpose. They could see the impact of the work they were doing to have an impact on people's lives. But these innovations only help really small markets. There's not a big market. You're not selling it to the general population. It's a subsegment of that market that has a very specific condition. And the challenge we always run into is it's hard to justify the investment. You can't raise a lot of funding, hard to raise venture dollars for this because there just isn't a large enough market to give the return. So for a lot of people, it's passion projects, money out of their own pocket to make this happen. And if you do serve the market, if you do convince yourself that you're going to go and do this, you end up having to charge such a high price in order to cover the cost of the R&D and design and manufacturing and supply chain and distribution and sales and support. That all costs dollars. So how do you trade that off? I've got a technology that can be really helpful in people's lives, but it's such a small market that I have to charge such a large price. So what are some examples of this? Well, one is just kind of using it as a very base example, is keyboards for those that are handicapped. So if you are blind, you typically have a keyboard that also has a what they call a braille display. It's a strip along the bottom, and if you're blind, you're running your fingers back and forth on that then allows you to read back where the cursor is on the screen and whatever text is appearing. Let me just give you an example, right? A normal keyboard today, you can go to Logitech and buy a keyboard for $35 or $40, right? They're pretty cheap, almost to the point of being disposables. A HIMS USB Braille display keyboard, guess the price. It's $1,345 for that keyboard. If you want to do a note taker, keyboard input, back, audio, all fully integrated, the HumanWare Braille note taker is $2,995. That's like 3 times the price of a laptop. But that doesn't count other technologies like puff control. If you're a quadriplegic, using puff severe to instruct the computer or whatever technologies you're using. Eye control, so it's following an eye tracking where you're looking. Right? The list goes on. But these are technologies that can have a positive impact, but they get left to the side. They get they either don't get developed because you can't rationalize the investment, or you have to charge such a high amount in order to get a return. And the challenge here for these orphaned innovations just absolutely plays out in spades in other areas, whether that's, in this case, what we were talking about, starting off the show, talking about my grandson, Caleb, is this whole experience of orphan drugs. And the part of this challenge of these orphan drugs and these orphan innovations is, how do you justify this investment? How do you get around to actually making these drugs available, having an impact on people's lives, but doing it in a way where it's just not financially out of reach to the people that you want to impact? You know, for instance, those individuals here in the United States who are blind or can see little, but they're dependent on augmented technologies in order to be productive because their eyesight is impacted, has upwards of like an 80% unemployment rate. So what is the role of using these orphan innovations, orphan technologies, and enabling these people to have a productive life, be able to have the social interaction, but also to have a job, be able to take those skills and being able to have some form of positive impact. At HP, we struggled with this. And in some cases, we just made the investment and just went with it, even though we lost money on these technologies. They were never a money maker. We did not believe in jacking up the price. We believed in keeping it as down as much as we could because it was just the right thing to do to serve even a very, very small segment of the community and doing that in the right way. So, and there's a lot of orphan innovations out there, and I'm going to be surprised. I'm going to guess that a number of you are aware of these orphan innovations that got abandoned to serve or help people and have an impact on people's lives that just never are going to see the light of day because you can't justify in a traditional P&L sense an investment that's going to give you negative return, albeit mentally we know it would be the right thing to do. So, orphan innovations, it's a label I'm attaching to this. It's something that I had experienced in my previous career as CTO at HP. I just didn't have a label for it. I was still frustrated by it. But we've got to find a way to make these things happen. So, we're going to continue on our discussions on orphan innovations and orphan drugs here in a second.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Before we get started, I just want to say a quick shout out and thank you to HP. HP is a sponsor of this segment of the Killer Innovation Show. They've recently come on as a sponsor, and I greatly appreciate the support. While I was CTO at HP supported some of our work in the nonprofit areas, such as hacking autism, where we would hopefully try to address some of these orphaned innovations for technologies to help people that were specifically on the autism spectrum. They also help some of our other charity work, such as Pioneer Education Africa, which is teaching creativity, innovation, raising the bar on education in Rwanda, Africa. So again, thank you, HP. If you're out looking for some new technologies, new laptops, check them out. The new EliteBook 360, which I am now using, and I'm carrying it every day. Phenomenal product. Z2 Workstation is here in the studio, does all the streaming and video work here. And we have an HP Slice, which acts as the collaboration platform here in the studio for running Zoom. So check them out. You can go to killerinnovations.com/HP and check out all the latest deals and latest technologies that they're offering. When I got dropped into the orphan drug world, which I had no experience or expertise in, I uncovered what's called the Orphan Drug Act, signed in 1983. It was basically to encourage drugs and treatments for diseases that have less than 240,000 individuals that are diagnosed with it. It's been ratified in the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, and now probably many other countries also. So the Orphan Drug Act, or sometimes referred to as ODA, has certain incentives. So for instance, if you are a pharmaceutical company, you have certain incentives to do work in drugs that have a very small market. So for instance, a 50% tax credit for development, 20-year carry forward on your tax credits. You get your FDA fees waived, which can be multiples millions of dollars. And the most important thing is you get a 7-year market exclusivity from the date of FDA approval. All with good intentions. Sounds great, right? This was put in place in order to try to address the fact that pharmaceuticals were not doing any work in the drugs that would help these people that were in these kind of orphan categories, diseases that just don't have a lot of people that are impacted by it. So, all good intentions. Now, with all good intentions, you got to be careful of what? The unintended consequences. And in the case of the Orphan Drug Act, there are a lot of abuses. Let's take, for instance, ACTH, which is a drug to treat West syndrome, which is what my grandson, Caleb, has. Now, this drug has been around since the 1950s, right? It's been around forever. But by having a pharmaceutical company flagging it for use for Wests, which is a rare condition, the drug company got exclusivity for its use for the 7 years since the FDA approval. Even though it was an old drug and they didn't do really any R&D work in it, they found that drug, applied it to West syndrome, attached it to West. They got 7-year exclusivity, which means the FDA will not approve any other drug or any generic for that drug to serve that condition. So the drug company got a 7-year exclusivity. Now, again, they didn't really do any real R&D. They just took an existing drug, got it flagged for treatment for a rare condition, and they secured the exclusivity. Great, it's a great deal. Now, you may be thinking, hey, they had to test it, didn't they? They had to validate it. Did you know that only 32% of drugs that qualify for orphan status go through any kind of double-blind test, which is normal for non-orphan drugs? Only 32% go through full testing. Now, they would argue that because the condition is so rare and there's so few people, there aren't enough subjects to do a full test. I don't know about that. But look, only 32%, so they don't even have the cost of doing the full double-blind test that normally is done with the FDA. Now, this is just one example. It's the one example that's most personal to me because I am now up to my armpits understanding what this whole orphan drug world is all about. Now, there are thousands of examples of these abuses when it comes to orphan drugs. So how much is this abused, right? We talked about the fact that they get exclusivity. So what do they do with this exclusivity? Let's take, for instance, ACTH. Again, this is just one of a handful of drugs that are used to treat West syndrome, which my grandson has been diagnosed with. ACTH in the U.S. costs $23,000 per vial. You heard that right. $23,000 per vial. While in the UK, that same drug costs $5 per vial. Yep. $23,000 per vial in the US, $5 per vial in the United Kingdom. Something wrong there, isn't it? Particularly given the drug's been around since the 1950s. It's not like it's a new drug that had to be invented from scratch. Now, Kayla's treatment with ACTH was estimated to be in the neighborhood of $60,000, of which insurance will not cover. So even though we have insurance is the Affordable Care Act insurance, this drug and many other drugs are not covered under those plans. So if you are an individual that doesn't have financial means to have private insurance, and even private insurances from corporations, many of them will not cover this drug. Now, in our case, my family, we are fortunate. I've been very fortunate. I've been blessed with my career. We've got this covered. But I think about all the people out there who don't. The drug that can help them, the drug that can save them, particularly with these rare conditions with orphan drugs, are just left out there to fend for themselves. Now, the drug companies would argue they need to get that kind of money because there's just so few people. But look, ACTH has been around since the 1950s. It's not a new drug. There's no R&D return needed. What is the rationale? And we're going to talk about more about that coming up as to some thoughts as to why this really just is driving me crazy. I'm looking at my grandson who's coming up on 8 months old, right? I'll be biased. He's cute as a button. And I would do anything for him. Anything. It just kills me to see him with these seizures. And again, I'm in a situation where we can do something for our family. But it has just been an eye-opener for me of how many families, people are impacted by something that was set up to be good, of encouraging the orphan drugs, that then in turn becomes so cost prohibitive that you can't even take the drug. There's a drug that can help you, but you can't afford to take it, so therefore your quality of life, your ability to survive longer gets compromised because you can't afford the drug because of this orphan status and the way it's structured. So, and again, ACTH is just one of multiple drugs that can be used with West syndrome. And some other ones actually have better outcomes. But this is just the example of one drug, been around since the 1950s, costing $23,000 a vial. How do you rationalize that? How do you even get your head around that? It is like beyond shocking. I'm speechless. I'm absolutely speechless. So as we go into this last segment, I'm going to share with you more about the orphan innovations, orphan drugs, and what I think we as a society need to think about. And how do we bring innovations that have positive impact on people's lives, making people's lives better? That is the role of innovation. So stay right there. We'll be right back.
This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
While companies and investors need to be rewarded for the risk of R&D innovation, we need leaders who bring ethics and morals to their business, to the industry, and to society as a whole. There's a current Wall Street requirement that the number one and only one focus of all public companies are to the shareholders, not to the employees, not to your customers. CEOs and their boards are ignoring the common good that can be delivered. We talk about it, we give it lip service, right? Legally, they cannot consider others as equal or more important than shareholders, unless, of course, they organize under what's called a B Corp or some similar structure. So the large corporations out there are required to put shareholders and shareholder return as number one. Now, yes, incentives do help encourage and fund research in areas that would normally be ignored. But we need to be aware of unintended consequences. We need to change the thought processes of CEOs and boards, particularly in areas like pharmaceuticals and orphan drugs. How do you rationalize what gets charged for a drug when there's minimal to no R&D involved? If there was a significant amount of R&D, you could kind of get your head around it, maybe. But when a company takes a drug that's been around since the 50s and applies it, but puts it through FDA approval, so they get the 7-year exclusivity, and therefore there's no constraint on what they can charge for those, for the exclusivity, because nobody else can compete with them. So therefore, they can charge unbelievably large amounts. I would argue that we as companies, as organizations, we need to think differently in these areas of orphan innovations, whether it's braille keyboards, screen readers, puff controls, accessibility technologies, other things that any of us do that can have a positive impact on people's lives. And then we as a society should give them credit for that. We should acknowledge that. We should thank them for that. Rather than looking at our pension fund and saying, wow, that company didn't give us such a great return because they gave away some stuff. And therefore, the stock price is depressed, right? It's not just the companies. It's those in the front lines, those of us who buy products and services from these companies should be willing to thank those companies that do recognize the value of addressing orphan innovations and orphan drugs. And there are lots out there. I'm not saying everybody's bad. Most are good. Most are doing great work. We need to acknowledge them. So you may be asking, how is Caleb? Well, actually, the night I'm recording this in my studio here in Colorado, we're getting ready to travel. Caleb's been rushed back into the hospital. My daughter and Caleb are in the car on a 4-hour drive back to the hospital. The seizures have returned. He was on some drugs, 2 sets of drugs. We stopped the seizures. And again, the quicker we can stay off the seizures, the lower the risk for any kind of brain damage. The seizures have returned. They are in transit. We're waiting for the phone call literally while I'm sitting here in the studio to hear the call from my daughter that they've arrived at the hospital. and then we'll understand what the diagnoses are. So we're early in this process. Don't know what that outcome is going to be. Over the next few months, we will be spending more time in Florida as a way to support our kids and our grandkids. We have a major checkup here in 3 weeks, so we'll know more. And as I'm doing more research into the orphan drugs, hopefully something good of this can happen. One, we can get Caleb seizures to stop. But at the same time, put a light onto the tragedy of this and the impact that it could have on people's lives. So I want to say thanks for letting me indulge myself and rant on something that I intellectually knew about, but I didn't realize the real world impact. I would ask each of you to think about what you could do to help with Orphan Innovations, to help others in need when there may not be a market return for your efforts. If we all help a little, it starts to add up, and it starts to add up pretty quickly. And I appreciate the flexibility you've given me here in today's show to be personal, to share with what we're going through as a family, to share what Caleb is going through at 8 months. I can't even imagine what he's feeling, what he's sensing. It's just heartbreaking to watch him with the seizures he's having. And you get 8 months, you can't communicate with him. So I appreciate you giving me the flexibility to listen to me and share my frustrations. Thanks for taking the time today to join us in the discussion. Check out the show notes. I'll have some links to some articles on the whole orphan drug situation. One particularly good one from the National Institute of Health, where they've done a study on the impact of the Orphan Drug Act. We'll post those links, so check that out over at killerinnovations.com. Follow me over on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You can find all the social media links at the top of the show site over at killerinnovations.com. If you have a topic, questions, or feedback, for instance, on today's show, you can post it over in the comments over at killerinnovations.com. You can drop me an email at phil@killerinnovations.com, or just post your comments on any of the social media spaces. Love to hear your thoughts. Appreciate the support, and I'll keep everybody updated as we try to navigate this medical situation, and hopefully try to unlock the value from orphaned innovations that can have a positive impact on people's lives. And how do we need to think differently about that? I'm early in my thinking. Would love your input and thoughts, so drop me a note. And with that, we're going to talk to you next week here on Killer Innovations. You're listening on the BizTalk Radio Network.